major drug trafficking bust tied to a violent crime at a troubled Minneapolis corner.
And today that the local Somali community says it's dealing with backlash from that investigation.
6:42 a.m., St. Paul, Minnesota.
Can't clear the basement yet? This is a different guy, different apartment.
The temperature was well below freezing. The streets of the Southern District were empty, save for the exhaust plumes of 3 unmarked federal SUVs idling at the curb. Inside those vehicles sat 11 federal inspectors from the FBI and the Department of Health and Human Services. They weren't there for a drug bust. They weren't there for a fugitive hunt. On paper, this was a routine compliance inspection of a state-licensed childcare center. If you believe stealing money meant for hungry children is a crime against humanity, hit like now and comment justice. The facility was run by Amina Farah Hassan, age 45, a director with a reputation that raised no suspicion. According to state records, she operated 5 separate childcare centers in the Twin Cities. Her files showed she was caring for more than 820 children every day. Because of these enrollment numbers, government subsidies arrived on time, quietly and reliably. Over 4 years, the total amount paid to her network exceeded $2.8 billion. But when the agents stepped out of their vehicles and approached the front door, the building was silent. There were no parents dropping off kids. There was no noise. The windows were dark. The lead inspector keyed the lock and pushed the door open. The air inside was stale and cold. The space felt wrong immediately. Type ghost children. If you're starting to see what they found inside, nothing was real. Toys sat on the shelves, arranged in perfect rows, covered by a thin layer of undisturbed dust. Cribs were fully assembled in the nursery, but the mattresses were pristine. They had never been slept in. Attendance sheets were posted on the wall, carefully filled out in blue ink. Every box was checked. Every name was accounted for. Yet the room itself had never known life. This single center had received more than $46 million in taxpayer subsidies over the last 12 months. Yet there was no evidence that a single child had ever spent a full day there. Inside the director's private office, investigators found the proof of the deception. On the desk lay a heavy binder containing a fraudulent roster of more than 700 children. As agents flipped through the pages, they realized the sophistication of the scheme. These weren't just random names. The network had created synthetic identities. They utilized real social security numbers purchased on the dark web, paired with falsified birth certificates manufactured in a backroom print shop. They had created an army of ghost children who existed solely in the state's payment database. Comment synthetic. If you understand this was industrial-scale identity fraud. The safe revealed everything, but the true horror was in the steel safe bolted to the floor in the corner of the room. When the forensic locksmith forced it open, they didn't just find ledgers. They found $38 million in cash, shrink-wrapped in black plastic. Sitting on top of the money were 5 heavy packages, stamped with a specific insignia, the scorpion logo of the CJNG cartel. At that moment, the inspectors realized this wasn't just welfare fraud. This wasn't just someone skimming off the top. This was a money laundering terminal for a transnational criminal organization. Amina Farah Hassan wasn't running a daycare. She was running a bank for the cartel, funded entirely by American taxpayers. Type cartel bank. If this connection shocks you, the numbers were staggering. The inspection had turned into a crime scene. By mid-morning, federal auditors began pulling the deep records tied to the facility's licensing numbers. What they found violated every standard of logic. The files showed that Samira Abdi Hassan, a relative listed as co-director, was managing multiple sites simultaneously. Birth dates for the children overlapped. Home addresses were duplicated across different cities. Yet from 2021 to 2025, the total reimbursements for the network reached $2.8 billion. In some months, deposits exceeded $74 million. The money was routed through 43 intermediary accounts before being redistributed. Less than 4% of the funds could be tied to legitimate operating expenses like food, rent, or payroll. There were no food supply contracts, no maintenance costs. Instead, the numbers told a different story. Funds were wired overseas in batches, each transfer kept just below the federal reporting threshold. $312 million was processed in less than 9 months through a single account that never paid a single employee. The money was moving to East Africa, the Middle East, and shell companies in Mexico. This operation didn't survive because it was hidden. It survived because it looked normal. Comment looked normal if you see how fraud hides in plain sight. The theater was elaborate. Behind the perfectly completed forms was a financial machine draining billions. Investigators discovered that the network had executed elaborate theater operations to fool the neighbors. They found a schedule in Amina's digital files labeled simulation shifts. It detailed rotations for actors hired to park cars in the lot during drop-off hours. They even installed outdoor speakers hidden in the bushes that played pre-recorded audio tracks of children laughing and playing on a loop during the day. They maintained a fleet of used car seats that were moved between vehicles to make parents look legitimate. It was a Hollywood-level production designed for an audience of one, the state inspector. By evening, the course of the investigation shifted from an audit to a manhunt. At 11:58 p.m., federal prosecutors issued authorization for a coordinated operation. This was no longer an inspection. It was a sweep. Within minutes, teams mobilized across Minneapolis. All 5 childcare facilities owned by the network were raided simultaneously. An additional 12 affiliated offices were breached. Type sweep if you support the federal response. The money started moving. As teams moved through the buildings, alarms began triggering across the financial network. Money started moving fast. In less than 18 minutes, more than $96 million was frantically rerouted through financial tunnels designed to collapse once activated. Someone on the other end knew the feds were inside. Then confirmation arrived that turned the operation into a pursuit. Surveillance systems recorded Amina Farah Hassan leaving her residence hours earlier. License plate readers tracked her vehicle heading south. Maritime records showed a private vessel scheduled to depart before dawn. She was running, but the investigation led to a darker location. By 2:18 a.m., analysts tracing the encrypted communications identified a hub 30 miles outside the city. It was an industrial property listed as abandoned. Tax records showed no activity for years, but utility records told a different story. Electricity usage at the abandoned site surged every night. Water consumption exceeded 90,000 gallons per day. At 3:06 a.m., aerial surveillance confirmed movement. Vehicles were entering the compound in timed intervals. Exhaust plumes rose from multiple vents. This wasn't a warehouse, it was a factory. And it was being funded by the money stolen from Minnesota's children. Comment Factory. If you want to know what they found inside, the breach revealed captives. At 12:21 a.m., the final order was given. The objective was entry. Floodlights cut through the darkness as tactical teams moved toward the compound's main access points. The structure didn't resemble a warehouse anymore. It resembled a fortified installation. The first breach came quietly. A controlled charge peeled back the steel door. Inside, the air wasn't just hot, it was toxic. Agents reported a metallic taste in their mouths the moment the seals were broken. The walls were lined with industrial scrubbers running at full capacity to hide the chemical signature from thermal satellites. Conveyor belts continued to move. Output counters ticked forward. But behind a secondary corridor, agents found the human cost of the operation. In a dim holding room, they found 61 individuals. 17 were American citizens. Others were from multiple countries. Several had been reported missing 6 to 9 months earlier. They were seated on the floor, malnourished and terrified. One man's pulse registered barely above 40 beats per minute. And the workers, they weren't just captives, they were ghosts. Their fingerprints had been burned off with acid to prevent identification if they ever escaped. This was the cartel's insurance policy against the human element. Type 61, captives. If you believe every victim deserves justice, the production scale was unthinkable. While rescue teams extracted the captives, evidence teams advanced to the production floor. What they found stunned seasoned officers. This facility was using the stolen childcare funds to purchase precursor chemicals. Ledgers showed purchases exceeding $1.4 billion over 18 months. The factory was producing 32 to 38 tons of fentanyl per day, alongside over 70 tons of cocaine per week. It was a closed loop. The government paid the daycare centers. The daycare centers washed the money. The money funded the drug factory. The drugs destroyed the community. By 4:19 a.m., the scale became undeniable. Production floors extended across 4 levels. One line item listed a single week's output, valued at over $3.2 billion. As dawn approached, the compound was fully under control. The silence that followed was heavy. Comment closed loop if you see how the system fed itself. The damage was generational. At 10:26 a.m., federal briefings began in a secured building. The total confirmed financial loss to the taxpayers stood at over $4.3 billion. That figure represented assistance that never reached the people it was intended to protect. Investigators estimated that more than 68,000 low-income children across the state had lost access to childcare because funds had been diverted to this criminal network. Legitimate childcare providers had closed because they couldn't compete with a fraud ring that didn't have to pay for food or staff. In some neighborhoods, licensed childcare capacity fell by nearly 22%. The system had not been blind. It had chosen not to look. Approvals had become automated. Oversight had become procedural. In a system built for efficiency, repetition was mistaken for reliability. This case forces a hard look at the vulnerability of the American welfare system. For years, the focus has been on accessibility, getting money to people fast, but speed killed verification. The Ghost Child Network exploited the very compassion that defines the system. They knew that bureaucrats are afraid to ask hard questions. They weaponized political correctness to steal billions. Type weaponized if you understand how they exploited the system's kindness. The lesson is accountability. The investigation into Amina Farah Hassan proved that the most dangerous threats don't always look like criminals. Sometimes they look like pillars of the community. They follow the rules, they file the paperwork, and they steal the future right out from under us. The factory is shut down, the money is frozen, but the question remains, how many other facilities are sitting empty right now, collecting millions while children go without? This wasn't just fraud. It was a betrayal of every family that trusted the system, every parent who believed their tax dollars were protecting vulnerable children, every community that thought oversight meant safety. The Somali community in Minnesota felt the backlash. Hardworking business owners saw less traffic. Retailers too, afraid to open their doors. But this was never about an entire community. It was about criminals who exploited trust from within. 92 people have been charged, 82 of them Somali Americans. But that doesn't define a community. It defines a network that weaponized identity as cover. The real victims weren't just taxpayers. They were the 68,000 children who lost access to real childcare. The families who couldn't find openings because ghost facilities took their spots. The legitimate providers who went out of business because they couldn't compete with fraud. Comment, 68,000 children. If you believe the real victims must be remembered, the system must change. This case exposed fundamental weaknesses in how America distributes welfare. Automated approvals, procedural oversight, speed prioritized over verification, and the assumption that repetition equals legitimacy. The ghost children existed in databases. They had social security numbers, birth certificates, attendance records. Everything looked perfect on paper because the system was designed to trust paperwork more than people. Amina Farah Hassan understood that. She knew that in a system built for compassion, asking hard questions feels cruel, demanding proof feels discriminatory, and bureaucrats would rather approve 100 fraudulent claims than deny one legitimate family. She weaponized kindness, and for 4 years, it worked. The factory produced enough fentanyl to kill millions. The money funded cartel operations across 3 continents. The captives had their fingerprints burned off with acid, and it all started with ghost children who never existed. Type never again. If you believe this can't be allowed to happen again, the future depends on vigilance. If you believe we need a complete audit of every welfare program in America, comment accountability below. If you believe oversight must replace automation, tap like. And if you want me to continue exposing systems that protect fraud instead of people, share this video and subscribe, because this operation proved something terrifying. The most sophisticated crimes don't break the rules. They master them. They hide inside compassion. They weaponize trust. and they count on good people in being too afraid to ask hard questions. The factory is gone. The captives are free. The money is frozen. But the lesson remains. Vigilance is not cruelty. Verification is not discrimination. And asking hard questions is not hate. It's the only way to protect the people these systems were built to serve. Because when speed replaces scrutiny, when automation replaces accountability, and when political correctness silences common sense, the most vulnerable pay the price. 68,000 children lost childcare. 61 people were held captive. $4.3 billion stolen from taxpayers. And a fentanyl factory funded by ghost children who never took a single nap. That's the cost of a system that stopped asking questions. Stay vigilant.